The garden was bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun, casting long shadows over the stone pathway. A warm breeze rustled through the towering oak trees, filling the air with the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine. I was sitting on the weathered wooden bench, lost in my thoughts, when my stepdad, Daniel, took a deep breath beside me. His fingers trembled slightly as he rubbed his palms together, a nervous energy radiating from him. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice quieter than usual, almost hesitant. I turned to him, sensing the weight behind his words. He was always the strong, steady one, the man who stepped into my life and tried his best to be a father without forcing it. But now, for the first time, he looked vulnerable. A strange feeling settled in my chest. Was he sick? Was something wrong with Mom? The tension in his expression sent a chill down my spine. He exhaled sharply, eyes fixed on the distant hills. "I've been carrying this truth for too long. And I don't want to hide anymore." I swallowed hard. "What truth?" He looked at me then, his gaze filled with both fear and hope. And in that moment I knew everything was about to change. The summer heat had begun to fade, replaced by the crisp touch of early autumn. Leaves, tinged with amber and rust, swayed lazily in the garden, falling onto the cobblestone path that led to the wooden bench where I often sat after school. This place, our little backyard sanctuary, was where I felt most at peace. I'm Ethan, 17 years old, just a few months away from finishing high school. Life has never been simple, but I've learned to adapt. My dad left when I was 5, and for most of my childhood it was just Mom and me. She worked long hours as a nurse, doing her best to give me a stable life. It wasn't always easy, but we made it work. Then, 4 years ago, Daniel entered our lives. At first, I didn't know what to make of him. He wasn't trying to replace my father, he never even pushed to be called Dad. Instead, he was just there. Quiet, patient, always showing up when it mattered. He married my mom when I was 14, and though I never said it out loud, I was grateful. He made her happy. That was enough. But even as I grew to respect him, there was always something distant about him. Like he was carrying a weight he never spoke about. Our house was a modest 2-story home in a quiet neighborhood just outside the city. It wasn't much, but it was ours. The backyard was Daniel's pride and joy. He spent hours tending to the flower beds, trimming hedges, and making sure the small vegetable patch thrived. He said gardening calmed him, gave him time to think. That afternoon, as we sat side by side in the fading light, I sensed something was different. Daniel had been acting off all day, distracted, lost in thought. It wasn't like him. Normally, he was steady, the kind of person who always seemed to have things figured out. But now there was an unease in his posture, in the way his hands fidgeted against his knees. My mom was working late, and it was just the two of us. I could hear the distant hum of cars on the main road, the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog, but here in the garden it was quiet. Almost too quiet. I glanced at him, waiting for him to say something, but he just stared ahead, eyes fixed on the horizon. Then, finally, he took a deep breath. "Ethan," he said, his voice measured but tense. "There's something I need to tell you." And just like that, the fragile sense of normalcy cracked. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, as Daniel shifted on the bench. His fingers curled and uncurled, his breath uneven. I had never seen him this nervous before. "Okay," I said slowly. "What is it?" He swallowed hard, as if he were forcing down a lump in his throat. His gaze flickered toward me, then back to the garden. "I've been holding this in for a long time. Too long." He paused, exhaling sharply. "Ethan, I'm gay." The words hung in the air, weighty and irreversible. I blinked, sure I had misheard him. My stepdad, Daniel, the man who had been married to my mother for 4 years, was gay? A strange, electric rush went through me. I wasn't sure what I felt. Shock, confusion, something else I couldn't name. My mind scrambled to make sense of it. "Wait," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You're serious?" He nodded, his jaw tense. I've known since I was a teenager, but I never had the courage to live as my true self. I tried to be what the world expected. I convinced myself that marrying your mom, building a family, doing what was normal, would be enough. But it hasn't been. And I can't keep pretending. His words landed heavily, each one reshaping everything I thought I knew about him. 1,000 questions raced through my mind. What did this mean for my mom? For us? Had he always been unhappy? I never wanted to hurt you or your mother, he continued, his voice tight with emotion. I love you both. I always will. But I can't live a lie anymore. I stared at him, my pulse hammering in my ears. He had always been the strong one, the reliable one. But now, sitting beside me, he looked fragile, afraid of what I might say. And that was the moment I realized, this wasn't just about his truth. It was about what came next. I had no idea how to respond, no script to follow. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same again. The words lingered in the air between us, and for a long moment, I just sat there, staring at Daniel. The garden, the sunset, the chirping of crickets, all of it faded into the background. My mind raced to process what he had just said. He was gay. My stepdad, the man who had stepped into my life when I was 14, who had been there for my mom, for me, was saying he had been living a lie. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but nothing came out. What was I supposed to say? That I understood? Because I didn't. That it was okay? Because I wasn't sure how I felt yet. Daniel sighed, running a hand over his face. I know this is a lot. I don't expect you to have the right words right now. I couldn't keep it from you anymore. I looked away, focusing on the small cluster of marigolds near the fence. My chest felt tight. I wanted to be the kind of person who reacted with instant support, but my emotions were tangled. My mom. What about my mom? Did she know? Had she always known? Does Mom? No, he said quickly. Not yet. He exhaled, shaking his head. I wanted to talk to you first. You deserve to hear it from me, not from her in anger or confusion. But I will tell her. Soon. I finally looked at him, really looked at him. His usual calm, composed expression was gone. Instead, there was vulnerability, something raw in his eyes. And suddenly, I realized, he was scared. Not just of what I might say, but of what would happen next. Are you leaving? The question came out before I could stop it. It was the thing that had been gnawing at me since he first spoke. If he was telling the truth now, if he was going to stop pretending, did that mean he would leave us behind? Daniel hesitated, and that hesitation was enough. I don't know, he admitted. That's not what I want, but I can't make promises I'm not sure I can keep. The honesty in his voice stung. I clenched my hands into fists, a wave of frustration bubbling up inside me. Then why did you marry her? It came out sharper than I intended, but I couldn't help it. If he had always known, if this had always been his truth, then why did he build this life with us? He flinched but nodded, as if he had expected the question. Because I wanted to be normal. I thought if I tried hard enough, if I loved hard enough, I could make it real. And I did love your mother, Ethan. I still do. But love isn't always enough. I didn't know what to say to that. For the next few days, everything felt different. At home, I watched him and Mom interact, looking for signs. Signs that she knew, signs that their marriage was already unraveling. But she was the same as always, rushing to work, reminding me to clean my room, laughing at Daniel's bad jokes over dinner. And Daniel, he was quieter than usual. Watching, waiting. Carrying a secret that wouldn't stay hidden much longer. At school, I felt restless. My best friend, Jake, noticed. Dude, what's up with you? You look like you haven't slept in days. I wanted to tell him. I almost did. But the words stuck in my throat. This wasn't just my secret to share. So I shrugged. Just family stuff. That night, I found Daniel sitting alone in the living room, staring at the dark TV screen. I hesitated before sitting next to him. Have you told her? He shook his head. Tomorrow. Tomorrow. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how everything would change once the truth was out. The next evening, I stayed in my room, heart pounding as I listened to the murmurs of their conversation downstairs. The tension in the air was suffocating. Then, suddenly, Mom's voice rose. I had never heard her sound like that before. You lied to me. Her voice cracked, and my stomach twisted into knots. All these years, Daniel. How could you do this? There was no anger in his voice when he responded, only exhaustion. I never meant to hurt you. You never meant to hurt me? Do you hear yourself? You built a life with me, with Ethan, knowing you were never fully in it. Silence. A painful, stretching silence. Then, in a voice so soft I almost missed it, Mom whispered, Was it all a lie? Daniel's response was immediate. No. I loved you. I still do. But not the way you deserve. I couldn't listen anymore. I grabbed my jacket and slipped out the back door, stepping into the cold night air. The garden felt different now, like the ghost of the conversation we'd had still lingered there. I sank onto the bench, staring at the stars. My stepdad had told his truth, and in doing so, he had shattered everything we thought we knew. A few minutes later, the door creaked open, and Daniel stepped outside. He didn't say anything, just sat down beside me, mirroring my posture. We sat in silence for a long time. Finally, I found my voice. What happens now? He let out a slow breath. I don't know. Are you leaving? I hated how small my voice sounded. He hesitated. Not yet. Not yet. That meant eventually. I clenched my jaw, staring straight ahead. I'm mad at you, I admitted. Not because you're gay. But because you let us believe something that wasn't real. I know. His voice was thick with emotion. And I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you if you let me. I didn't answer right away. Because the truth was, I didn't know if I could. Over the next few weeks things changed. Mom barely spoke to Daniel, and when she did, it was tense, clipped. The air in the house felt different, heavy with unspoken words. One evening, after dinner, Daniel stopped by my room. Can we talk? I sighed but nodded. He sat at the edge of my bed, looking uncertain. I don't expect you to understand right away. But I want you to know. I'm still here for you. That hasn't changed. I studied him. The man who had been my stepdad for years. The man who had driven me to soccer practice, helped me with math, taught me how to fix a bike chain. He wasn't perfect, but he had been there. And despite everything, he still was. I don't hate you, I said quietly. A small, sad smile touched his lips. That's more than I could ask for. We weren't okay yet. Maybe we wouldn't be for a long time. But for the first time since that night in the garden, I believed we might get there. The rain poured in heavy sheets, drenching the city in a cold, relentless storm. Ethan stood under the dim glow of a street lamp, his breath visible in the chilly night air. His hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the weight of the decision he was about to make. Behind him, through the large cafe window, Daniel sat alone at a corner table, staring into his untouched cup of coffee. His shoulders were hunched, his face lined with exhaustion. He looked smaller than Ethan had ever seen him. Ethan had spent the past few weeks avoiding this moment, drowning in anger and confusion. He told himself he didn't care what happened next, that Daniel's choices were his own burden to carry. But as much as he tried to push it all away, the ache in his chest refused to fade. Mom was filing for divorce. She hadn't said it outright, but Ethan had overheard the late-night phone calls, the quiet sobs behind her bedroom door. She was hurt, betrayed, but she was trying to stay strong for Ethan. And Daniel was waiting, not just for Ethan, but for the inevitable unraveling of the life he had built. Ethan clenched his fist. He could walk away right now, pretend he never saw Daniel sitting there. It would be easier, wouldn't it? To let resentment win, to let the man who had raised him disappear into the past. But that wasn't who Ethan wanted to be. With a deep breath, he pushed open the cafe door, the bell chiming softly as he stepped inside. The warmth of the place wrapped around him, the scent of coffee and rain-dampened coats filling the air. Daniel looked up, surprise flickering across his face as Ethan approached. "You didn't have to come," Daniel said, his voice uncertain. "I know," Ethan replied, pulling out the chair across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, thick with everything left unsaid. Then, finally, Ethan exhaled. "I don't know how to forgive you yet." Daniel nodded slowly. "I wouldn't expect you to. But I don't want to hate you either." Ethan swallowed, forcing himself to meet Daniel's gaze. "You lied to us. You hurt Mom. And yeah, maybe you thought you were doing the right thing back then, but it doesn't change the fact that you let us believe something that wasn't real." "I did," Daniel admitted. "And I hate myself for it." His hands curled around his coffee cup, knuckles white. "But I love you, Ethan. That has never been a lie." Ethan's chest tightened. He wanted to hold on to his anger, to keep his walls up, but the truth was, part of him had been waiting to hear those words. "So, what happens now?" Ethan asked. Daniel gave a sad smile. "That's up to you." Ethan looked away, staring out at the rain-streaked window. He wasn't ready to forget, and maybe he never would be. But for the first time since the truth had come out, he realized he didn't have to figure it all out in one night. He looked back at Daniel, studying the man who had been his stepfather for years, the man who, despite his mistakes, still sat here hoping for another chance. Ethan took a slow breath. "We figure it out. One step at a time." Daniel's eyes filled with something Ethan couldn't quite name, relief, gratitude, maybe even hope. And as the storm raged on outside, they sat together, no longer as strangers divided by secrets, but as two people willing to try. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty, but something had shifted. Ethan no longer felt like he was drowning in anger and confusion. He still had questions, still felt the sting of betrayal, but he had opened a door, and that was enough for now. He stayed at his mother's house most nights, trying to support her in the quiet ways that mattered. He helped with dinner, made sure she wasn't alone for too long, and sat with her in the living room, even when no words were exchanged. She was hurting, but she was strong. She always had been. One evening, as they sat watching the television without really paying attention, she finally spoke. "Have you talked to him?" Her voice was soft, but there was no bitterness in it. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. We met for coffee the other night." She didn't look away from the screen. "How was it?" Ethan considered his answer. "Hard. But I think it was the right thing to do." His mother exhaled slowly, nodding. "Good." She reached over, squeezing his hand. "Whatever you decide, Ethan, just make sure it's what you want. Not for me. Not for him. For you." Those words stayed with him. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan kept meeting with Daniel. Their conversations were cautious at first, mostly small talk, surface-level things that avoided the deeper wounds between them. But eventually those walls began to crack. One evening, Daniel invited Ethan over to the house he had moved into. It was small but cozy, with bookshelves lining the walls and soft light filtering through the curtains. Ethan had always known his stepfather loved books, but he had never realized how much until now. Daniel gestured toward the couch, nervous but hopeful. I wasn't sure if you'd ever come here," he admitted. Ethan sat down, running a hand over the fabric of the couch. "Me neither." For a while they just talked. About Ethan's classes, about the music he was listening to, about anything that wasn't heavy. And then, after a pause, Daniel reached for a photo frame on the coffee table and handed it to him. Ethan took it, studying the image inside. It was an old photo. He must have been around 10 years old, standing next to Daniel at a park. They both had ice cream cones in their hands, and Daniel was laughing at something while Ethan grinned at the camera, chocolate smeared across his face. I always loved that day, Daniel murmured. You kept insisting that chocolate was better than vanilla, and I told you I'd prove you wrong. But then I ended up stealing bites of yours instead. Ethan let out a small, surprised laugh. I remember that. Daniel's expression grew serious. I know I made mistakes, Ethan. And I know I can't undo them. But you were never a mistake. The love I have for you, the years we spent as a family, that was always real. Ethan swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the frame. He had spent so long questioning everything, but hearing those words helped settle something deep inside him. He exhaled slowly and set the photo back down. I know. They didn't need to say anything more. As months passed, Ethan continued rebuilding. It wasn't perfect. There were days he still felt resentment, moments when the hurt resurfaced, but he didn't let it consume him. He saw his mother moving forward, too. She had started taking pottery classes, something she had always talked about but never pursued. One evening, she proudly showed Ethan a misshapen vase she had crafted. It's ugly, she admitted with a laugh. But it's mine. Ethan smiled. I like it. Healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning to carry it differently. One day, Ethan found himself walking through the same park from that old photograph. The air was crisp, and the sounds of laughter and conversation filled the space. He watched as a little boy ran up to his father, tugging at his sleeve excitedly. For a brief moment, Ethan saw himself in that child. He thought about Daniel, about the man who had raised him, loved him, and, despite everything, had never stopped trying. Ethan pulled out his phone and hesitated for only a second before sending a message. Hey, want to grab coffee this weekend? A response came almost immediately. I'd love that. Ethan slipped his phone back into his pocket, breathing in the cool evening air. For the first time in a long while, he felt light. Not because everything was fixed, but because he had chosen not to let the past define his future. Some stories didn't have perfect endings, but sometimes just choosing to turn the page was enough. Years passed, and life moved forward in ways Ethan never could have predicted. He graduated from college, built a career he was passionate about, and found a deep sense of belonging in a community that embraced him for who he was. He still carried the memories of the past, but they no longer felt like weights dragging him down. They were simply part of his story, lessons woven into the fabric of his life. His relationship with Daniel had taken time to mend, but it had become something neither of them had expected. They weren't just repairing what had been broken, they were building something new, an understanding based on honesty, mutual respect, and the love that had never truly disappeared. One afternoon, as they sat in a quiet cafe, Ethan watched Daniel stir his coffee absent-mindedly. There were strands of gray in his hair now, lines on his face that hadn't been there before. But his eyes still held the same warmth Ethan remembered from childhood. I'm proud of you, Daniel said suddenly, his voice steady but full of emotion. Ethan smiled, letting the words settle. I know. As he left the cafe, stepping into the golden light of the setting sun, Ethan felt a deep, quiet gratitude. For growth, for second chances, for the courage to let love, however imperfect, find its way back in.